41. And if you turn to that page 41 where it says Freedmen's Bureau, Black Codes, PDA, Scallywag, Carpetbagger, you know, we did these terms, and some of you, yes.
Just try and stay in between like these 3 to 4 seats.
Okay. All right.
Angle's not the best.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks, Gary.
You're welcome. Anytime, Mr. Wallace.
That's the man. That's the main man. But I think the first term there is Freedmen's Bureau, is it not? And that's where we concluded that night. We concluded with the Freedmen's Bureau that afternoon at like 6 o'clock when we were going through. And we had gone through the Civil War. And Bobby, what are you saying over there to the
I asked what thing you're on.
Did you tell you the Freedmen's Bureau?
Yeah, I couldn't find it.
So you got it now.
Yeah, I
found it. Good. So anyways, we had gone through the Civil War. I do want to recommend still that if you do want to look at something for study purposes, to take a peek at Lincoln and emancipation. I mean, I just think being the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, that's kind of a big deal. The Lincoln movie that came out, that's kind of a big deal. The 13th Amendment, that's something that maybe, the AP might, put something on. And we did mention, we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation being, issued in the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam. We talked about, Lincoln's, kind of reluctance to do that, the issues that were, surrounded that. So anything that you can look at regarding that might be good, Now, we did say this, that the Emancipation Proclamation only liberated those slaves that were in areas that were still part of the rebellion. So when the war ended, or as the war was ending, there were still a significant number of people who were legally enslaved. Those people were freed by the 13th Amendment, which was passed through both houses of Congress in January of 65. And remember, it was Lincoln kind of rushing to get that passed because he was afraid the war was going to end, and it does end in April of 65. And he was afraid if slavery wasn't fully abolished by the time that the war ended, that there wouldn't be energy to deal with it. They would just kind of be there, and he even questioned the constitutionality of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a wartime, kind of endeavor. In peace, would it be repealed? Would the Supreme Court repeal it? Would the slaves be re-enslaved? So Lincoln, pushes hard to get the 13th Amendment past the House of Representatives, and he does. He is able to get that passed. It is ratified by 2/3 of the states, and that's what abolished slavery. So we did talk, and we were in that book a little bit about the aftermath of the Civil War and the era of Reconstruction. And we said that the big question, in Reconstruction is what will become of the ex-slaves? What would become of them? And we said the first thing that was, sort of in question is how would they meet their basic needs? And the Freedmen's Bureau was an attempt. There were 4 million ex-slaves, right? There were 4 million slaves that were liberated into a society that was totally devastated by war. Most of the South was in rubble. Their infrastructure was destroyed. Railroad tracks pulled up. Buildings destroyed. And there's our friends. That's right. You don't need to go over there, Gross. You don't need to meet the new. You come here. You set the standard goes for that team, an academic standard. That's right. Very good. So, anyways, we were talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, and we said that the Freedmen's Bureau was passed in February of 65, and it was a response to the reality of the conditions of the ex-slaves. Here were 4 million people that didn't have any money. Here were 4 million people that didn't have any education. Here were 4 million people that didn't own property, that couldn't possibly get jobs because there wasn't jobs to get. The South was an agrarian society. They couldn't put their crop in the field in 1865. So this was a serious situation, and the Freedmen's Bureau was a combination of a welfare agency and a relief agency, a disaster relief agency, where lots of northern do-gooders and northern philanthropists and others that wanted to help went down into the South in order to participate in this. And we said the biggest thing that the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be kind of responsible for is education. slaves were by law not permitted to be educated. And so when the Freedmen's Bureau opened schools, blacks enthusiastically attended these schools to learn how to read because they thought that that would be the key to their future success. Now, what's the next term, Belay? After Freedmen's Bureau? Oh, the Black Codes. Now, remember the discussion in the aftermath of the war was, okay, what's going to happen to the ex-slaves and who's going to dictate this? Now, it's clear that they are going to be liberated because of the 13th Amendment. But what would their status be? Both Lincoln and Johnson kind of contended that the ex-Confederate states, once reconstituted and readmitted into the Union, could decide the status of slavery on their own. Or not the status of slavery, the status of the ex-slaves on their own. What would they be? Would they be full-fledged citizens? Would they be, partial citizens? What rights would they have? I mean, Lincoln is going to stress and urge ex-Confederate states to enfranchise African-American males that served in the military. But he's not going to really put any demands on those the states under his 10% plan. And when Johnson takes power and institutes another plan for Reconstruction, he puts very few requirements on the southern states dealing with African Americans either. Remember, Lincoln dies in April of '65. Between April of '65 and December of '65, Johnson is the president without Congress in session. He laid out a plan for the southern states to reconstitute themselves and to basically be readmitted or reincorporated into the Union. All of the southern states followed either Lincoln and Johnson's plan. They were all ready to re-enter the Union in 1865. In December of 1865, when they did, they created conditions for their ex-slaves that were embodied in the Black Codes. The Black Codes were the regulations and laws that individual states passed to kind of relegate former slaves to a condition of second-class citizenship. Former slaves did not have the same rights as others within those states, and the Black Codes were viewed by Northerners as a backdoor attempt to reinstitute slavery. Now, if you think about it, in terms of like the history of things, we're actually going to talk about this a little bit tomorrow. The Black Codes is the first, establishment of a relationship between these 4 million slaves and, white people. And that's rejected by Northerners mainly for a number of reasons. And then there is this period of time that's called Radical Reconstruction. There's that battle. Remember, there's that battle between Johnson and Congress over the nature of Reconstruction. The 14th Amendment is a part of the battle. What does the 14th Amendment do? If the 13th Amendment made, freed the slaves, the 14th
gave them citizenship.
Made them citizens, and the 15th, the right to vote.
Right.
3 Civil War amendments. 13th, freed the slaves. 14th, made them citizens. 15th, gave them the right to vote. If you think about it, during this period of radical Reconstruction, which really is going to be between 1867 and 1877, that's when former slaves are enfranchised, they participate in politics, they run for office, they hold office, but in that 10-year period, the Republican Party forced radical Republican rule on those ex-Confederate states, and African Americans had some measure of social and political equality. After '77, radical Reconstruction is overturned, and then what happens is now the post-Reconstruction states pass new laws to regulate or relegate the status of African Americans, and those are called Jim Crow laws. So the Black Codes are reconstituted as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, however, dealt more with segregation, segregating the South between blacks and whites socially in terms of education. And that segregation really comes to full fruition in 1896 with the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, right? You know, and we talked about that, separate but equal. That decision is overturned in 54 with Brown versus the Board of Education. And so it's interesting, the status and condition of the ex-slaves after the experiment of Reconstruction doesn't remarkably change from 1877 to 1954. Most African Americans continue to live in the South. I mean, there was the great migration of African Americans during World War I to northern cities, but most African Americans are still Southern. You know, the relationship between blacks and whites are segregated. The real crack in that segregation is the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, and then the subsequent attempts to desegregate afterwards, which we'll talk about. Now, there's also a term, is it scallywag? Is that the first one below?
Yes.
Is there another one down below that?
Repudiate.
Repudiate means to go against or to deny. One of the things, the reason I put repudiate there is because the Southerners were forced to repudiate their debts, you know, as a result of, you know, the Reconstruction programs. But scallywag and what's the other one? Carpetbagger. Remember, those were that was a part of the constituency that ruled, you know, the South during radical Reconstruction. Radical Reconstruction is that 10-year period between 1867 and 1877 when the Republican majority in the House and Senate forced on the white South these radical regimes that enfranchised African Americans and gave them some measure of equality politically and socially. You know, they're going to last for, you know, sometimes in some cases 10 years, sometimes less, right? During that time, it was the ex-slaves and the scallywags and the carpetbaggers. And carpetbaggers were northerners who came to the South, right? Former freedmen's people, military people, other people that came from the North to the South, held positions oftentimes, started businesses, ran for office, deeply resented by white Southerners. Scallywags were white Southerners who participated, embraced the radical regimes. And white Southerners detested them, and they certainly detested the former slaves because they thought that their position was beyond what it should have been. You know, look, when the white South had a chance, you know, they relegated African Americans to second-class citizenship in any manner they needed to. Look, including lynchings. Remember, we looked at lynchings, passing laws, lynchings, you know, whatever they needed to do, and resisted tenaciously any attempt to alter that. You know, any attempt to alter that on the national level, they tenaciously resisted. Federal anti-lynching laws, other things, attempts to desegregate, court decisions, etc. I mean, and that's kind of the battle we'll talk about tomorrow. Now what I want you to do is that we'll leave with scallywag and carpetbagger. We'll pick up with those terms when we come back here Monday night. Now what I want to do is go back to the antebellum period. So if you're taking notes, go back to the antebellum period. The antebellum period is that period of time we were talking about the last time we met after school. And when we were talking about that period of time, Theodore, we were talking about the notion of nationalism, you know, the post-war of 1812 nationalism, and the sense of the era of good feelings, you know, Henry Clay's American system. And we kind of concluded our conversation with a discussion of the Missouri Compromise. You know, because we said, look, despite this sense of nationalism, you know, Western expansion, and the big three, you know, kind of 19th century, trends are Western expansion, which, you know, is accelerated after the War of 1812, you know, industrialization, the growth of factories, urbanization, movement of people into the cities. And really that lasts from 1915 to 1900. But in our conversation, we talked about it, you know, in class we talked about it, then we suspended our conversation, talked about the Civil War and aftermath, and then we resumed our conversation and talked about the Gilded Age. But if you think about it, the same things are happening. The same things are happening before the Civil War is happening after. I mean, they're somewhat different, you know, I mean, you know, the industry is bigger, it's more technologically advanced than it had been prior to the Civil War, you know. The transportation that connected the country was more sophisticated, after the Civil War than before the Civil War. The westward expansion went into the Wild West, and prior to the Civil War, it's going up to the Mississippi River. But, you know, it's the same three things. And we were talking about them. One thing I did want to mention, the AP loves this, transportation revolution. That in this Gilded Age period where you had this internal development, right? That you know, focused on nationalism, but eventually is going to be destroyed over the issue of the extension of slavery. One of the things that contributes greatly to that is the transportation revolution. The steam engine, who do we associate with that? What name? The steam engine, go ahead. Fulton, Robert Fulton, 1807, the Claremont, you know, the steam technology that allowed riverboats to go up the river. In addition to steam technology, what connected the East and the West? That was the big challenge, yes.
Railroads?
Well, not at first. And railroads eventually. We'll get to that. Go ahead.
Canals?
Canals and turnpikes, right? Canals and paved turnpikes. But the canal boom was really kind of interesting. Building all these canals that would connect the East and the West so freight could be moved less expensively. And the most famous canal, of course, Grave,
The Erie Canal.
the Erie Canal, your personal favorite, which I think, hey, what state was the Erie Canal in? Do you remember? Yeah. New York, entirely in New York? What two cities, Alice and Perry, were connected by the Erie Canal? We asked this at the time, nobody knew it, no one could get it, and now no one still can get it. Two cities, Alice and Perry. Starts in, ends in, and what city was made by the Erie Canal? What city really becomes the major, you know, hub of trade as a result of it, Alec?
New York?
New York City. It is the Erie Canal that really sets the stage for the canal boom. The success of the Erie Canal inspires others to build it. We can say this, nobody else, no other canal is as successful and as lucrative as the Erie Canal. It was a false sense that others could be like the Erie Canal. Okay, so, you know, the transportation boom is steam technology, it's canal technology, it's turnpikes, and then eventually, Alec, it is the railroads. And the railroads had an advantage over the canals because the topography didn't have to be such that water could flow, and, you know, you could go over mountains, and, you know, you could go in places that ordinarily you couldn't go with canals. And by the time the Civil War started, the canal era had ended, the railroad era had begun. But if you think about it, the railroads connected, and the canals connected, the industrialized East with the large-scale farming in the West. And the East was manufacturing products that were being sold in the West, and the West was producing grains and food that were consumed in the East and sold abroad. And it was the South that eventually was the odd man out. You know, the South didn't need internal improvements. They had a network of rivers and, you know, other things that could get their cotton and their tobacco to ports, and then could be exported into the world. You know, cotton in particular, tobacco to a lesser extent, were lucrative cash crops. Slaves became more valuable. Their society was defined by slavery, where slavery repressed or you know, really diminishes, you know, what people thought of work. You know, I mean, that's one of the things you see when you read about it. Lincoln and Northerners kind of venerate work and, you know, people who work and opportunity. And slavery diminishes work. You know, work is what the slaves do. You know, the other people don't. So what transpires in the transportation network as a part of that is kind of the emergence of two separate kind of societies. You know, the South is different from the North and the West. And then it becomes a battle for who is going to dominate the national government and the agenda thereof. Is the government going to finance internal improvements? Is the government going to, you know, pass higher tariffs? And then most disturbingly, is the government going to pass legislation that might threaten the institution of slavery or eliminate it? And that's what eventually certainly leads to the Civil War. Now, in terms of that political turmoil, in our conversation, we left you in the era of good feelings, right? And that was the Monroe administration, which lasts from 1816 to 1824. In 1824, there are 4 Republican candidates for the presidency. In 1824, here's who they are. The 4 Republican candidates are the popular Andrew Jackson, who was from Tennessee, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, a war hero of some note. Henry Clay, who sometimes was called Harry of the West. I mean, Henry Clay of Kentucky, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Henry Clay was a powerhouse, influential war hawk, a leader within the Republican Party, and an advocate of the American system. William Crawford, who was the heir to the idea of limited government, Jeffersonian democracy, and was the seated Secretary of Treasury in the Monroe administration, and John Quincy Adams, who might have been the most successful Secretary of State the United States had ever had. Quincy Adams had inked the Adams-Honest Treaty. Quincy Adams had produced the Monroe Doctrine. Quincy Adams had been an expansionist on some level, and a nationalist. And these 4 candidates were all nominated by certain groups, right? I mean, it was Crawford that was nominated by the Republican caucus. And I think the Tennessee legislature nominated Jackson. I mean, we didn't have a system by which to nominate presidents. So there were 4 people who basically let it be known that they wanted consideration for the presidency. They were all Republicans. We don't have really resistance on, or kind of any kind of opposition to the Republican Party on the national level. We all know what happened. Under the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, the top 3 vote getters in the Electoral College would be considered by the House of Representatives if no one person got the most and the majority of the vote. And no one person did. All right, Jared, let's see if I remember it. Jackson, you have it written down there? The numbers, the vote total in your notes? Are those your notes from then?
No, I don't have my notes from there.
Yeah. Does somebody have their notes from there? No? You have it written down? Let's see if I remember it. Jackson got 99. John Quincy Adams got 87. 84, son of a gun. John Quincy Adams got 84. Crawford got 67. And Clay 37. Oh, what was it? 41 and 37. And so Clay was last, right? So Clay was out of the picture. Jackson led it, but didn't get the most, right? And John Quincy Adams was second. Crawford had a debilitating stroke, so he was out of the picture. So the election in the House of Representatives came down to a contest between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Who won that contest and why, believe?
Adams, because he made a deal with Clay.
Allegedly. Allegedly, Adams made a deal with Clay. Clay supported Adams over Jackson. Adams and Clay were different people, but they had a similar ideology. They supported the American system. And Adams, Clay supported Adams, used his influence in the House of Representatives. Adams is elected to the presidency. Jackson is denied it. What do the supporters of Jackson proclaim the whole thing, Theodora? They called it something. The fact that it appeared as if a deal had been made. Because Adams, Clay supported Adams, and Adams appointed Jackson to be his, Adams supported Clay to be his Secretary of State. And they called it what, dear Theodora?
I know it, but I just can't remember it right
You
now.
can't recall it. You can't retrieve it. Yes.
A corrupt bargain.
Corrupt bargain. They called it a corrupt bargain. Now, Adams is going to be president for 4 very non-productive years. He is president from 24 to 28. In that time, he has a very difficult time. The Jackson people feel denied, of the presidency. They take control of the House of Representatives in 26. They use their power to undermine anything that Adams wants to do. Adams ideologically believed that the national government should take action to build the strength and the power of the country. Internal improvements, a national university, observatories, whatever, might build the strength and the power of the country. He is a nationalist. In fact, his supporters and Clay's supporters begin to refer to themselves as national Republicans. Jackson and his supporters begin to refer to themselves as Democratic Republicans. So the two-party system that had kind of faded away, at least on the national level, reemerges with the national Republicans and the Democratic Republicans. And the national Republicans, by and large, were the remnants of the Federalists. Right? That's the Federalist Party, rejuvenated and broadened to some extent. And the Democratic Republicans are the remnants of the Republicans. Right? Not really the remnants, they're the continuation of the Jeffersonian Republicans. And realistically, you know, the Jacksonian Democrats were advocates of a limited national government, small national government, you know, more states' rights, you know, but their fear, you know, their fear, the Democratic Republicans, is the power of government would be used for some and not for others. Privilege, right? Now, in 28, Adams is defeated by Jackson. Jackson is triumphantly elected as president. His supporters are enthusiastic about, you know, Jackson's election to the presidency. He is a symbol of kind of a changing America, a Western, non-educated, non-Eastern elitist that now was president. Even Jefferson, you know, with his advocacy of the people, even Jefferson was still an aristocrat. You know, I mean, and you know, Madison was an aristocrat, and even though they were plantation owners and might have, you know, advocated small government, they were still aristocratic. I mean, Jackson is an orphan child. Jackson grows up in the backwoods of the frontier. Jackson is never formally educated. Jackson has this vicious temper, you know, but ideologically, Jackson, you know, fundamentally, the fundamental thing that he believed is that people should not unfairly benefit from government, right? And that government, by and large, should stay out of people's way and let states and people handle things themselves. Now, we see Jackson's ideology come to fruition when he advocates rotation in office. Now, I want to speak about this for a minute because, you know, it kind of is a trend that continues in American history. And that is, Jackson is the first president to kind of wholesale remove a significant number of civil servants from office. I mean, civil servants are government employees, and the government did not employ that many people. I don't know, what did I say there? Was it about 10,000? Did I have it written there in your notes? About 10,000 people, something like that. You know, total throughout the whole country. Jackson removes about a tenth of them, you know, about 900 or 1,000, and replaces them with people who are loyal to him. I mean, this becomes what we call political patronage. Okay, when we're elected, we'll replace the office holders and the other positions with people who are supportive of us. And it becomes known as the spoils system because to the victors goes the spoils. And the spoils of politics are these civil service jobs that people can hold, and they're not in the coal mine, and they're not out in the fields, and they're working in offices and in other places with a guaranteed wage from the federal government, from tax dollars. Certainly, you know, Jackson sets this precedent which expands and expands and expands. I mean, the idea of patronage hiring in the Gilded Age exploded to 150,000 positions that changed every election. Lincoln complained of office holders. Johnson complained of office holders, you know, harassing them for office. And eventually, remember, it is Garfield, Bobby, who is assassinated by a disgruntled office holder. You know, James Garfield was elected president, and then Guteau, what was his first name? Charles Guteau killed him and said, I'm a stalwart and Arthur is president. Now, I mean, so that the patronage system that starts with Jackson's rotation in office, which he defends. Jackson defends this as being non-elitist. He said, well, look, these people have these jobs and they have, you know, they were put in them, and this is a privilege that everyone should have a chance at, or more people should have a chance. We should rotate these jobs. Right? We should rotate these jobs because anybody can do them. Right? Anybody can do them. So these positions are simple. Anybody can do. We should rotate them. This is democracy. This is fairness. And that explodes to where, you know, Guteau assassinates Garfield over that. And the Congress does eventually respond to reforming civil service. What's the piece of legislation? Does anybody remember first piece of legislation that is passed that reforms the civil service? It is in 1883. We're really going up in history now. But in 1883, anybody remember besides the instructor and Bobby Giuliani? Go ahead, Bobby.
I don't know.
You do know, if I call him Weissman, he remembers it like it was yesterday. Go ahead, Weissman.
Can't say I do.
Son of a gun. Son of a drum.
You know,
It's hard to believe you can't remember.
I know.
Yes, go ahead.
It was either the Pendleton or the Hatch Act?
Pendleton.
Pendleton.
The Hatch Act dealt with it. That was later, but it was the Pendleton Act. Pendleton Act was the first one, created the Civil Service Commission, first one to deal with, kind of dealing with the patronage that started with Jackson. In addition to rotation in office, the other thing that Jackson does is ignore the formal cabinet and establish the kitchen cabinet. That was the informal advisors that he had that gave him advice about various things. And so what Jackson does in so many ways is try to weaken kind of the elements of the federal government that he sees as being kind of controlled by privilege. The civil service, the cabinet, and even the Congress. Remember, Jackson is going to assert a strong presidency, stronger than any previous president. Jackson is going to veto more pieces of legislation than any previous president had ever done. In fact, more than all the previous presidents had ever done. And Jackson is going to veto legislation that he simply doesn't like. That was a precedent that really hadn't been fully established yet. I mean, Washington believed the veto should be kind of reserved for issues of constitutionality. And other presidents hadn't used it, but Jackson vetoes several pieces of legislation. Maybe one of the most important, which we didn't mention in class, Krumka, but I will mention to you now, is the Maysville Road veto. That's 1830. The Maysville Road veto. And there, what Jackson vetoed was the congressional funding of a road that would entirely be built in the state of Kentucky. So this was an internal improvement, right? Government-financed internal improvement that Jackson vetoes, right? One of the things that was true is the Maysville Road traveled through Henry Clay's district. And so there's this question whether, is this a great ideological statement on Jackson's part, or is this just Jackson being petty against his enemy, who he hated? But he vetoed that simply because he didn't like it, right? Another thing that you should remember about the Jackson administration, it probably is the most important thing in his first term, Indian removal. The Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830. Does anyone besides Hera and myself remember what the Indian Removal Act did and who was involved with the Indian Removal Act? Hera.
Wrong person.
Jim, look at this. This is a great moment, Jim. Usually you and Emily are bantering about this stuff. She's inappropriately touching you, touching the book bag, harassing you generally. But go ahead.
Okay. It was, we tried to remove all the Indians in the South.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, no, he tried to remove the Native Americans. Now, you called it the Native Americans in the South. And that's true. You know, it was the 5 civilized tribes in the South. They were going to be removed to where?
Oklahoma.
Yes, they were going to be transported across the Mississippi to reservations. So the idea of the Indian Removal Act is that Native Americans and I think this is true, that did not adopt white ways would be relocated. And the irony of the Indian Removal Act is the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, and most prominently the Cherokee, really had adopted white ways. I mean, they had their own newspaper, they had their alphabet. Cherokee Indians held slaves and had plantations. Yet the Indian Removal Act provided for those Native Americans to be uprooted from their land and transported like it or not, right? Remember the battle between the Cherokee and Jackson makes it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court on 2 occasions rules in favor of the Cherokee, right? Nevertheless, the Indian Removal Act culminates with the Trail of Tears. And the Trail of Tears is that brutal relocation that happens with whatever the remnants of those Native American tribes are, and they are viciously forced across the Mississippi to Oklahoma. Yes.
Was the Trail of Tears during Jackson?
No. The Trail of Tears is 1838. That would be the administration of Van Buren. But Jackson is largely credited, with kind of establishing that. And Van Buren is really a disciple of Jackson that follows through on it, yes.
How come if the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokees, they were still
That's the other question. Remember when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, and basically what they said is the state of Georgia had to stop, what they were doing. And what they were doing is pushing Native Americans out of their land. Jackson just ignored the ruling. Right? He ignored the ruling and he said, John Marshall has ruled, now let him enforce it. And so this was, a question of, the balance, or, remember you wrote that essay about, did he protect the Constitution, the balance of power between the branches, did he elevate the presidency with more power than the founders intended the presidency to have? Was this good or bad for, the country and for, our legacy? Weaken the Congress, weaken the courts, strengthen the presidency. I mean, remember, Jackson is going to argue that the president is the only true representative of all the people. He's the only person, or she, and maybe in the future, that is elected by everybody, right? All the other people have a kind of regional interest. The other thing that happens in Jackson's administration is the Nullification Crisis. Now, we did mention that before. We mentioned that on the Saturday when we were here, Bobby. We talked about nullification. And interestingly enough, nullification was an extension of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The idea, Jim, that the Constitution was a mere compact among the states, and that the individual states could interpret the Constitution for themselves, and they could declare acts of Congress that they believed inconsistent with the Constitution unconstitutional. Who was the architect of the actual practice of nullification? John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun was a war hawk who was elected as a Republican, a war hawk, a nationalist, that eventually Calhoun, the nationalist, who supported the Second Bank of the United States, supported protective tariffs, advocated for the American system, is going to back away from that. As the South kind of falls more into kind of sectional differences with the North and the West, Calhoun backs away from that and becomes an adamant states' rights, Southern pro-slavery Democrat. It is Calhoun that delivers the speech that coins the phrase positive good for slavery. Remember we said in terms of slavery that at first there was a consensus in the aftermath of the Revolution that slavery, Kromka, was a necessary evil. But eventually, as slavery took a more prominent role in Southern society and it distinguished that society and profited that society, Southerners began to say, oh, no, no, no. Slavery is not a necessary evil. It is a positive good. We read Calhoun's speech where he said this, that it was a positive good. And remember, we contrasted that with Jefferson, who said, I tremble for my country when I think God is just and his justice can't sleep forever. Right, and that the slavery was inherently wrong, and we were kind of stuck with it. And then Calhoun is defending it. It is Calhoun that articulates the notion of nullification in the South Carolina Exposition and Protest in '28. And what sets Calhoun and Southerners off at that point is tariffs. Right, the tariff of abomination in '28, which Southerners see as being deleterious to their interests. But under the surface is always the argument that if they can do this with tariffs and they can do this that seems to be outside the Constitution, then can they go after slavery? Now, on some level, let me mention this, Camden, that Jackson was a slaveholder. Jackson was a slaveholder. Jackson was a supporter of slavery. Jackson did things to muzzle abolition during his administration. opened the mail, authorized the post office to open the mail and eliminate abolitionist rhetoric from the mail. But Jackson believed that a powerful Democratic Party that was dominated by slaveholders, that promoted small government, would protect slavery. And what they feared, that party, was a national party, national Republicans and Whigs, that were dominated by idealists and do-gooders and religious people and Northerners and eventually abolitionists that would use the power of government to destroy slavery. So as long as the Jacksonian coalition remained together and dominated the national government, the presidency, the court, the Congress, they weren't too worried about things. But if you remember, when the South secedes, it's because, you know, that the House of Representatives, the Senate, the presidency, and eventually the Supreme Court was going to fall under Republican control. And that's when they didn't think they had any more protection. Nullification was intended to protect the minority. If a state didn't think something was constitutional, they could declare it null and void, like the Tariff of Abominations. And that's exactly what South Carolina did. Remember, South Carolina declared a tariff revision to be unconstitutional. You know, the Tariff of Abomination was revised, and it was revised to the point insultingly so. And South Carolina called a special convention. The delegates, I think, did they vote 169 to nothing? Is that in there? I keep calling on you. You're getting irritated with me, I understand. I think it was like 169 to nothing. It's not in your notes. I think they voted to nullify that 169 to nothing. Or maybe that was to secede. Maybe it was to secede, it was 169 to nothing. But something was overwhelmingly, they voted to nullify the tariff. And then that's when a showdown between Jackson and South Carolina ends with the force bill being nullified, right? Now, one of the things to remember about the nullification crisis is even though South Carolina does not secede from the Union, and they do not nullify a meaningful law, they don't surrender the notion, right? The notion of nullification is not surrendered, and South Carolina is going to take a logical conclusion to that and secede from the Union in 1860. In addition, in 32, Bobby, Jackson is going to run, as the nullification crisis is unfolding, Jackson is going to run for re-election. Who does he run against in 32? Clay. This is the second time that Clay is running against Jackson, and Clay and Webster are quite confident that Clay is going to be elected, and they attempt to make an issue out of something that did not necessarily need to be an issue in 32. What was it, Rose?
Wasn't it like his wife was still, Jackson's wife was?
No, she died in 28. You're one election off, right? This is the next election. It's something, yes, good. The second bank of the United States. Jackson did not believe that the second bank of the United States was constitutional. Jackson didn't believe that the second national bank of the United States was a good idea. Jackson wanted to get rid of it. It had been chartered for a 20-year period, Lillian, beginning in 1816 through 1836. All right? Now, what Jackson, wanted to do is allow the bank's charter to expire. Clay, the candidate, and Webster, his buddy, influenced the then bank president, Nicholas Biddle, to push for an early rechartering in the summer of 32. Now, they reasoned that both houses of Congress would quickly recharter the bank. They did. And then they reasoned if they sent that bill that rechartered the bank for an additional 20 years to Jackson, he would either veto it, making him appear a moron to many people, or he would sign it that would undercut his popularity with his own constituency. Clay and Webster believed that there was far more support for the bank out there than there actually was. Jackson did very quickly veto the second, or what would be the third bank of the United States, and he issued a ringing veto message. Jackson's bank veto message is a document that you might likely see on the test or something to do with it, because in that message it really embodies the Jacksonian ideology. Because what Jackson says in that message is, look, the world is an unfair place. By its nature, some people have more and some people have less. The world is an unfair place. But government shouldn't make it any more unfair. And the second Bank of the United States and a third Bank of the United States would do that. It would perpetuate inequities. It would make the rich richer, it would make the privileged more privileged, and the common folk would not proportionally benefit. Therefore, this is something the national government should not do. So he vetoes the bank, and Clay and Webster try to use this against him, but Jackson is overwhelmingly reelected in 32. After he's reinaugurated, Jackson goes to fully, kill the second Bank of the United States, because it had 4 years more to go. It wasn't going to go out of existence until 36, and there were 4 more years to go, and Jackson feared that the then bank president, Biddle, would use the financial power of the bank to get it rechartered. And so remember what Jackson tries to do is pull the government's money out of the second Bank of the United States. And he has to basically fire or reposition 2 secretaries of Treasury before he can do that, before he finds somebody who is willing to comply with what he wants to do. Does anybody know who he found? It's trivial, but it's somewhat significant. The Secretary of Treasury that actually ends up following, to an extent, Jackson's wishes with the bank, turns out to be a significant person later. Does anybody remember? His name was Roger B. Taney. Right? Roger B. Taney. Anybody know why he turned out to be significant later? Go ahead, Theodore. He ends up being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He ends up replacing John Marshall as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Roger B. Taney is going to have a very infamous decision that he writes. Anybody know what that is? We talked about it before yesterday. The Dred Scott decision in 57. And one of the reasons that Lincoln is going to be so anxious to get an amendment passed, that frees the slaves, is that Roger B. Taney is still the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he was a pro-slavery Maryland Southerner. So, that was the fear, that would be. But here he complies with what Jackson wants, and the money of the United States is drawn from the bank, and the bank eventually collapses, and there is not a third Bank of the United States until 1930. So you had the first Bank of the United States that was advocated by Hamilton in 1791. You had the second Bank of the United States that was promoted by Madison and members of Congress in 1816. That bank dies by 1836. Between 1836 and 1913, there is no national banking. And remember, we said in 1907, when there was a very sharp and deep recession, that a committee convened and said, one of the problems is we are a burgeoning, growing, industrialized, urbanized country that does not have organized central banking. So we need some type of organized central banking, and the response to that was the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, and that was in 1913. The Federal Reserve Act, remember, created a national banking system, not one national bank with multiple branches, but a national bank system that combined public ownership or public oversight of that system with private ownership of the district banks. The Federal Reserve System era is still in existence to this day. So it was founded and so that's virtually 100 years. It's 100 years old. And one of the things that the Federal Reserve today did, and one of the things that the advocates of a bank wanted, was a reliable currency, regulating member banks, and things of that nature to keep the financial structure of the country stable. Well, okay. Jackson is going to leave office in 36 after 2 terms, reestablishing the 2-term tradition. Remember, Washington served 2 terms, Jefferson served 2 terms, Madison served 2 terms, Monroe served 2 terms, Jackson served 2 terms. The Adams father and son were both voted out after 1. Right? Jackson's successor was his vice president, and that was Martin Van Buren in 36. I should tell you this. The next person to be elevated from the vice presidency to the presidency was George H. Bush. So, you know, if you look at all of the by election, right? You know, I mean, there have been a lot of people that ascended to the presidency because of the death of the president, but a vice president elected to be president, the next person after Van Buren did it was George H. Bush. And remember, Nixon tried it in '60. We just talked about that today, but he was defeated, right? Mondale tried it, you know, well, he wasn't the seated vice president, but, you know, others tried it as being seated. Gore tried it as being seated vice president. He was defeated. The first person to do it after that, and the only person to do it after that, was George H. Bush, who was Ronald Reagan's vice president. All right. Van Buren, is the president, and, you know, with Van Buren there is kind of the legacy of the Jacksonian era, of Jacksonian democracy. And, you know, one of the things that I wanted to mention is that while Jackson is a part of the national political kind of landscape, Jackson believes in the voice of the people. You know, what we get in the United States during Jackson's era is genuine Jacksonian democracy. Democracy was considered to be a negative word to Washington, to Adams, to others. The idea of the common folk influencing, you know, leaders was not thought to be productive, right? You know, I mean, democracy was had a negative connotation. The Jacksonian era ushers in an era where the idea of the common man and the people influencing government at every level becomes something that's celebrated. Yes?
You say that, but you also said that this was the kind of the first presidency where Jackson kind of like...
It's an irony. Yeah, it's ironic because on one hand Jackson, and that's the big discussion of Jackson. I don't know if you remember the little snippet of a videotape that I showed you. And it was all these things about Jackson. Was he a tyrant or was he a saint? You know, was he an advocate of democracy or was he a dictator? You know, and in terms of Jackson, that's true. He celebrates the common man. He celebrates wider participation. He claims that he's the representative of the people, but then he yields dictatorial powers, undermines the power of Congress, you know, which really is responsive to the people. And that was the whole discussion in that question that I asked you guys. I don't know if you remember that essay. Remember that essay, Weissman, that I asked you that question? You wrote it, did such a nice job of writing it. And that was the irony of it. But this is true, Alan. There's no doubt that voter participation, that there was broader enfranchisement. You know, more people were eligible to vote. More people actually voted. More offices were directly elected. You know, the presidential nominating process was brought more closely to the people. There's no doubt that America became more democratic in this time period. How much you attribute that to Jackson is a good question. You know, Jackson's a good question for the AP because there's differences of opinion. And the AP likes things where they can ask you a question, and they really like it if they can ask you a question and there's two different positions, if half the kids in the country take one position and the other half take the other position, they think they've done their jobs. Right? So Jacksonian democracy is one area you can do. So let me just wrap this up really quickly. Van Buren's problem is the Panic of '37. Right? The Panic of '37 is a 20-year panic that inflicts the country. And there's numerous causes, whether Jackson was responsible, whether it was, you know, problems in Europe that was responsible. The Panic of '37, you know, decimated the country. Van Buren really is labor's burdened under that. By '40, it's clear that the Whig Party, and the Whig Party had emerged as the party against Jackson, right? And they called themselves the Whigs because that was traditionally the party allied against the king, King Andrew I, right? And the Whig Party was confident that they would elect the president, and they do in 1840. And that's William Henry Harrison and Crumpke. His name was Old Tippecanoe. That was his nickname. And he was elected president, and he served for a grand total of about 30 days, right? Harrison died of pneumonia 30 days after he was inaugurated, and his vice president was John Tyler. And Tyler was a states' rights, ultra states' rights Democrat who fled the Democratic Party and Jackson's party over nullification. And so Tyler behaves as a states' rights Democrat even though he's a Whig. And if you remember what transpired, one more thing, I promise you. If you remember what transpired, Tyler so alienated his own party that they kicked him out. And he looked for an issue that he could, kind of, hold on to be renominated in '44, and that issue was expansion. The annexation of Texas and 5440 or fight in Oregon. Tyler doesn't get the renomination, Polk does. But the issue of expansion is going to be what leads to the sequence of events that causes the Civil War. Because, the issue is going to be, can slavery spread into the territories that are acquired as a result of the Mexican cession or as a result of anything else? And that issue ends up being ultimately resolved by the Civil War. Well, all right, we'll conclude there, and then we'll give you a chance to get back and watch the rest of that going on.
Yeah, 0-0.
I hate you, Captain.
Oh, sorry, it's not 1-0-0. So I'm gonna score, I actually lied.
Oh.
Heads are losing 5-0.